Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and definitely one of the most contentious political transformations of the 20th century. We're going to track exactly how a wealthy Spanish farmer's son from rural Cuba evolved into the hardened leader of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. This is the origin story of a regime that would go on to outlast 9 U.S. presidents. So we're going to look at the cold, hard facts, the specific tactics, and the major turning points that shaped his ascent to power.
Okay, let's dive into this by acknowledging the massive elephant in the room right off the bat. Fidel Castro's legacy is incredibly polarizing, to put it mildly. To his supporters, he's revered as this champion of socialism and anti-imperialism who finally wrestled Cuba's independence away from American influence. But to his critics, he is viewed as a brutal dictator who systematically suppressed human rights, caused a massive exodus of his own people, and totally crashed the Cuban economy. Now, in this explainer, we aren't here to take sides, not at all. Instead, we're going to objectively examine the historical facts to understand exactly how he built the power to invoke such intense, completely contrasting reactions.
To do that, we've laid out a historical roadmap. We are going to track his tactical escalation across 5 distinct phases, starting with his youth and early rebellion, moving to the Moncada Barracks attack, his exile and the Granma expedition, the grueling Sierra Maestra campaign, and finally consolidating national power in 1959.
Let's kick things off with Phase 1, Youth and Early Rebellion.
Contrary to what you might assume about a famous communist revolutionary, Fidel Castro actually did not start out in poverty. Not even close. He was born in 1926 to a very wealthy Spanish immigrant farmer and attended elite Jesuit boarding schools. But his political awakening really exploded when he got to the University of Havana. He enrolled as a law student there in 1945, and at the time, the university was an absolute hotbed of anti-imperialist ideas. It also had this violently competitive political culture known as gangsterismo. Castro just completely immersed himself in this environment. He eventually started carrying a gun for protection after getting death threats and formally joined the left-leaning Partido Ortodoxo. During these student years, his ideology shifted profoundly. Looking back on it later, he noted that without understanding Marxist class struggle, a person is just a blindfolded man in a forest, not knowing anything. And this wasn't just him reading books in a library, right? He was physically out there fighting in violent left-wing uprisings abroad, like the massive 1948 Bogotazo riots down in Colombia. He was really beginning to see the entire world exclusively through the lens of a struggle against the bourgeoisie. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate turning point that forced Castro from being just a radical student into a full-blown armed militant. It happened in 1952. General Fulgencio Batista seized power in Cuba via a military coup, completely canceling the very elections that Castro was actually running in. So what did Castro do? Well, first he tried to fight it legally in the courts, but when that failed, he escalated. He formed an underground network of clandestine cells, and finally, realizing peaceful democratic avenues were totally closed off, he began stockpiling weapons for a military assault. Which brings us to Section 2, the Moncada Barracks attack. His first real strike. On July 25, 1953, Castro took a massive, audacious gamble. He led 165 lightly armed rebels against a major military garrison outside Santiago de Cuba. The plan was pretty straightforward: seize the armory, arm the impoverished sugarcane workers, and spark a massive popular uprising. But the reality, it was a catastrophic failure. Cars got lost in the dark, the alarm was raised way too early, and the rebels were just pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. In the aftermath, Batista's government enacted a brutal crackdown. They rounded up suspects and actually tortured and executed 22 of the rebels without a trial. But here is where Castro showed his political genius. He somehow managed to turn this absolute military defeat into a massive public relations victory. He acted as his own defense counsel during his trial and essentially used the courtroom as a national political platform. He pointed out the army's illegal use of torture. He cited the beloved Cuban independence leader José Martí as the true intellectual author of the attack, and he delivered an impassioned speech that would later be published under the famous title, "History Will Absolve Me." Despite that incredibly eloquent defense, he was still sentenced to 15 years in the model prison. But he definitely didn't waste his time. He organized the other political prisoners, formalized his group into the 26th of July movement, named after the date of the failed Moncada attack, and deeply immersed himself in reading Marxist theory, Shakespeare, and Kant. Basically, he was prepping for his next move. And that leads us to part 3, exile and the grandma. So Castro didn't serve his full 15 years. In what turned out to be a fatal miscalculation, Batista assumed Castro was totally neutralized and granted him a general amnesty in 1955. Knowing he still wasn't safe staying in Cuba, Castro, along with his brother Raul, fled to Mexico. There, out of Batista's immediate reach, they officially began planning a full-scale guerrilla war to overthrow the regime. They aggressively raised funds and even sought military training from a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. Now, what's really interesting here is a fateful alliance that formed in Mexico, one that would literally change the course of Latin American history. On one side, you have Fidel Castro, fiercely driven, looking for tactics, looking for funding. On the other, you have Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor who Fidel recognized was actually a much more advanced Marxist-Leninist than he was at the time. Together, they formed this incredibly powerful ideological and military synergy. Fast forward to November 1956. 81 revolutionaries squeezed onto this decrepit, leaking little yacht called the Grandma and set sail for Cuba. It was a miserable, stormy, seasickness-inducing journey. And when they finally landed in a mangrove swamp, Batista's forces were already waiting for them. Following a devastating military ambush, out of those 81 men, only 19 survived to flee inland. But flee inland they did. And that brings us to the fourth phase of our timeline, the Sierra Maestra campaign. These dense, rugged mountains became the ultimate proving ground for the surviving rebels. To survive against a far superior, well-equipped conventional army, Castro strictly utilized guerrilla warfare. We're talking hit-and-run tactics and constant ambushes. But it wasn't just military strategy, it was heavily psychological. To win the trust of the highly suspicious local peasants, the rebels would do things like provide medical treatment to wounded soldiers, but simultaneously they brutally executed abusive land overseers who were despised by the locals. Furthermore, Castro strategically hid his more radical Marxist views from the international press, choosing to promote a moderate, pro-democracy agenda to secure broad support from urban anti-Batista groups and foreign journalists. Let's look at how this pressure campaign just steadily built up over 2 grueling years. They started small in early 1957 by overrunning a very minor outpost. But by the spring of 1958, they had established a literal shadow state in the mountains. They had their own hospitals, schools, and amazingly, even a rebel cigar factory. When Batista tried to finally crush them with 10,000 troops that summer during Operation Verano, the army, which really lacked guerrilla experience, failed miserably and suffered massive defections. Finally, totally isolated, losing all U.S. support, and facing a total infrastructure blockade by the rebels, Batista fled the country on New Year's Eve 1958, taking over $300 million with him. And that sets the stage for our final section, consolidating power. On January 8, 1959, Castro made this triumphant entry into Havana to absolutely cheering crowds. But the revolution was really just beginning. So the crucial point here is how Castro immediately balanced his early administration. On one hand, he enacted deeply popular moderate moves, like appointing a civilian president and dramatically halving rents for the city's poor. But simultaneously, he executed these radical, unyielding moves to consolidate total control. His forces expropriated lucrative mafia-owned casinos and, most controversially, orchestrated rapid military trials that resulted in the mass executions of hundreds of Batista loyalists. These actions drew intense international criticism, but they absolutely cemented his domestic power. Very quickly, the illusion of a diverse, moderate coalition just vanished. The moderate civilian politicians were either pushed out or forced to resign. And on February 16, 1959, Fidel Castro was officially sworn in as Prime Minister of Cuba. He began ruling entirely by decree, indefinitely delaying multi-party elections and systematically shifting the country toward a one-party socialist state perfectly aligned with Marxist-Leninist principles. So what does this all mean for us today? Consider how these foundational years, the ideological shifts back in university, the utter failure at Moncada, the harsh, brutal survival in the Sierra Maestra, how did all of that set the stage for the next 5 decades of Fidel Castro's deeply polarizing rule? The guerrilla tactics he perfected in those mountains became the very blueprint for his lifelong grip on Cuba during the absolute height of the Cold War. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.